mai ki tēnei mātauranga ngā mihi nui ki a koutou tauhou haere. Welcome to all of you and welcome to this first of our Boundaries webinars for 2021. The first of four. The expectations of those will be outlined in just a moment. But I want to really express my thanks for your willingness to register and for your commitment to this program. I hope that you enjoy the benefit of this being recorded, and a special hello to all of you who are signing in sometime in our future. It's brilliant that you've been able to take advantage of this facility that we have now. In a moment, we will talk about the session's content and related expectations, but first let's pause for a moment in the presence of the one who loves us and listen to some scripture and pray. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Amen. As Christians, we aspire to follow Jesus so closely that we taste the dust from his sandals. We look to Christ as the apprentice looks to the master, always seeking to imitate and learn. In this reading from Philippians, we are reminded that God was willing to accept boundaries, to become fully human and obedient even to death. Likewise, as ministers in his church, we are called to humility and to holiness. And so we pray. Incarnate God, help us as we aspire to exemplary lives, to care for the needy with Christ-like compassion, to build up Christ's congregation, to strengthen the baptized, collaborate with colleagues, and demonstrate conduct that reveals your kingdom on earth. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So here is a schedule of what we're trying to achieve this evening, and we're right on time at the moment. You'll see, first of all, we're going to talk through some expectations of what it means in this new environment in the light of the last 10 years of reflection and work and the Royal Commission, and how that might affect people right across our church in a way that it hasn't previously. Then I'll invite Bishop Philip to come online and talk about his experience of the Royal Commission, with some reference to the process, how Anglicans became involved, the timeline, what's next, and then he'll open the session up for you to ask any questions. Now, if you do have questions, we'll do our best to monitor both the chat line and any raised hands. If you do raise a hand to ask a question, pause for a moment, we'll unmute you and then invite you to say what you need to say. After that, we'll move through to the new Title D legislation. And I want to give you an idea of where to find it, who it applies to, some of the critical changes before we go into more detail, particularly around Canon 1, which is the Code of Conduct, and Canon 3, which is concerned with the complaints procedures. At the end of the evening, which I promise will be by 8:30, we'll have space for questions as well. And if we don't get the chance to answer all those questions tonight, please do send them in and I'll ensure that they're answered and made available with tonight's presentation, both the paper form and the video form. So here are the expectations that we've been talking about. The first thing is that this is for all licence holders. So anyone who has a lay licence or a clergy licence and PTOs As we go on, I'll explain that the canon also applies to anyone who's signed the declarations of adherence to the Constitution Te Pauhere. So it's a very broad scope that we're looking at now. But in the first instance, PTO, clergy and licensed lay ministers are our priority audience. There will be 4 sessions, each will be 90 minutes, and it's roughly 1 a month for the next 4 or 5 months. You'll see the next one is on the conventional approach to understanding boundaries and power. The third is around social media and the internet. And the final one has content yet to be confirmed. It'll be an advanced session looking at some topical issue. Of course, all of them will be recorded, so please, if any of your friends or colleagues are anxious about having missed or other commitments, do let them know that all of this will be available online in the fullness of time. I know that some of you are excited about the quiz. The quiz is a way of us meeting the new expectations around a commission auditing the diocesan response and approach to training of ministers on boundaries. So we are being considered. One way of demonstrating our commitment to boundaries and our learning of boundaries is to complete a test. Very straightforward, there are no surprises. It's directly connected to the PowerPoint presentation that you have tonight. So if you have that in one hand and a quiz on screen or in the other hand, I'm confident that with a couple of shots, you'll get the 80% that's required to demonstrate a really convincing pass. Okay, if you've got questions about that or you want to talk about that, please do be in touch with me.
Thank you, and look, thanks everyone so much indeed for committing yourselves to this process. As Stephen's outlined, these sessions, 3 out of 4 of them, are a requirement, and the need for us to become absolutely thorough about this kind of process and commit to it ultimately has to do with our commitment to the well-being of people. It has to do with our determination to keep people who are within our care safe. Stephen's asked me to speak a little bit about the Royal Commission on Abuse and Care. And the important thing to recognise there is that it is a focus on abuse that has taken place when people have had every right and reason to expect that they would be cared for, that they would be respected, and that they would be safe. The reality is that in both our state and faith-based institutions, that has not been the case in some circumstances. It's important, I think, to be really clear that the Royal Commission is not driving the change to our legislation, but it certainly influenced the timing of its implementation. On the 25th of January, the revised Title D legislation came into force, and it was my privilege at 4 o'clock this afternoon to commission and establish the Ministry Standards Commission and to agree to the appointment of the first registrar of the Ministry Standards Commission for the Anglican Church. And it's a privilege to announce that the Honourable Justice John Priestley has accepted the role of Foundation Registrar. John is one of New Zealand's preeminent jurors. He was a judge of the High Court in New Zealand for about 13 years. He has a PhD in jurisprudence. He's known for his thoroughness and for his compassion. He knows us from the inside out. He's a committed Anglican and married to an Anglican priest. I initiated the review of the Title D legislation about 4 years ago. So prior to the Royal Commission being established. We did so because of the rising number of complaints that bishops were having to deal with, and an acknowledgement that we were not dealing with them consistently across the Episcopal units of this church. There had been no comprehensive review of our professional standards and disciplinary canon for about 10 years. The Royal Commission also influenced our determination to review the canon thoroughly. But you'll remember that initially the faith-based communities were not part of the original terms of reference of the Royal Commission. The churches and other not-for-profit organisations lobbied the government very strongly in asking to be included. And we asked to be included, as I've said on a number of occasions, because we believed that we would not be able to provide a credible parallel process to the state Royal Commission process. We wouldn't have the capacity or be seen to have the independence to do so. So we were really keen that we should come under the terms of reference of the Royal Commission, and we committed ourselves to fully cooperate with the Commission. Victim survivor groups were also very strong in their advocacy for the inclusion of the Royal Commission, the faith-based communities in the Royal Commission's terms of reference. And so the government responded to that and we were included. I think it's important to say also that we gave very clear instructions to Council. Those instructions were that they were to fully collaborate, fully cooperate. They were not to cross-examine survivor witnesses, that we needed to trust the true diligence of the Royal Commission's process and trust that those survivors who gave evidence, even if we felt that there were some details of their evidence that were challengeable, that the core of their evidence should be trusted and the Commission's process trusted. So we were not allowing our Council to be adversarial in their approach to the work of the Commission, but cooperative and collaborative. So the Royal Commission has had already a number of hearings that we've participated in. The first public hearing was to set the terms of reference and to describe to the public the nature of the Commission's work. There was then a procedural hearing which debated the procedures that would be used and set the parameters, and then we had a series of what were called contextual hearings where expert witnesses were called to talk about the way in which the Commission might proceed with its work. We applied for what's called core participant status, which allows us to be represented in every hearing. So our legal team has a table. They are able to engage at every stage of the process. We're one of only 4 core participants, 3 faith-based, 1 and the Crown. We've found that to be really important. It's enabled us to build strong relationships with the Council for the Crown, for the Commission, or Council advising the Commission, and that's meant we've been able to work with them in defining the scope of their requests of us. Notwithstanding that, their requests have been substantial. They serve what are called Section 20 notices, and we have to comply with those notices, and we have to comply within the time frame. That has meant, for example, the supply of more than 100,000 pages of documentation going back through that 50-year period. We're often not given a great deal of time, and I just want to acknowledge and pay tribute to the staff of dioceses and amarangi, of provincial bodies and of schools who have been under enormous pressure to respond to the Commission's expectations. We've just been through or in the middle of what are called the redress hearings. So these are hearings looking at what the Commission might recommend to the Crown in terms of, or to the government rather, in terms of frameworks for redress for survivors. So that includes a whole range of provisions that might be put in place for survivors, including financial redress. So our briefs of evidence have been submitted, and the hearings for those are in March, in the middle of March. It was originally scheduled for Holy Week, and we persuaded the Commission that that was a pretty tough ask on the Christian community to be in the hearings in Holy Week. For example, I'm expected to be cross-examined for about 2 full days. I've been asked to set aside 3 days for potential examination of my evidence, which has been given on behalf of the Church. So to try and achieve that in Holy Week would have been a bit on the nose. Notwithstanding that, the last Section 20 notice arrived on the 23rd of January, and we had to submit all of the papers by the 15th of January. So some of the timelines have been really difficult to respond to. We've offered 2 briefs of evidence in response and on behalf of the National Church. I'm just looking for them now. And then a number of bishops and other institutions have also provided briefs of evidence in response at the subpoena of the Commission. So my primary brief of evidence, for example, will hold an apology on behalf of the Church. It describes the nature of this Church, the nature of the province, the framework of the Church, the relationship between the Church and the Commission, some observations of abuse at provincial level, a look at our Title D and policies that flow from it. We talk about the boundaries training, such as this, that we're participating in tonight and in subsequent sessions. We offer some contribution around redress and reparation for harm. I look at things like independence, the volume and efficiency, standard of proof, legal liability, those sorts of things. And then I reflect on the nature of ordination and the nature of liability, the Church's liability, the bishop's liability for the actions of those who hold the bishop's licence. And we accept that there is vicarious liability. In other words, that if the Church authorises someone to act in its name, then we are liable for those actions. And so there are questions about if someone is acting as a scoutmaster and they're also a priest, to what extent is the Church liable? And we're taking the position that a priest is a priest is a priest. And that the community has the right to expect that the priest will hold themselves and be held by the Church to the highest possible standards. I then respond to a number of the specific survivor evidence that we heard in late November, early December. Just to say that the survivor evidence was describing some of the most extreme examples of abuse that I've heard in my life, and that some of the behaviour was vicious and cruel and done in the name of the Church. The Commission will move then to a series of case study hearings later this year, and into the new year 2022 they'll move to evidence around schools. We're asking the question about whether state boarding schools will also be included in the process. So let me talk briefly about the implications of the work of the Royal Commission already. It's absolutely clear that the Church's expectations of licence holders have to become even more explicit, and we have to be absolutely vigilant about recording, about firstly ensuring that all of the expectations of professional standards are met by everyone who holds the bishop's licence, and that that is well documented, and that we need to be prepared if, for example, the government establishes an independent review authority for faith-based institutions, that we are able, on request, on subpoena, to supply full documentation of any case they may ask us to address into the future. So, what's also become clear to the bishops is that we need to have a different approach in relation to permission to officiate. So you'll be getting a letter from me shortly. We'll be establishing a new category, which will be called permission to officiate emeritus. That will recognise the ordained person for the ordained person that they are, but they will only be able to lead a service with the explicit permission of the bishop every time, or delegated to the archdeacon, and the permission must be sought every time. That's because a standard PTO is going to have to return to a situation where we expect those with a PTO to have supervision, to have spiritual direction, and to attend these courses, boundaries courses, on a regular basis. So in other words, if you are able to lead services on a regular basis, you're going to have to fulfill all of the expectations of professional standards. And that's a really significant change. We know that's going to be a difficult change for people, but it's absolutely clear already that if we don't put that in place, we will be required to put it in place by the end of the Commission's work. We're also really clear that the threshold for deposition, being deposed from holy orders, will need to be much lower than it has been. It's untenable, for example, that someone who simply received an admonishment at the time, when that case came to an appeal tribunal chaired by the primates, the very clear unanimous decision of the tribunal was that the matters were of such a serious nature that the person, the individual, should be stripped of holy orders. Now, that inconsistency between being told off and the review of an appeal tribunal saying, actually, this person has so fundamentally breached the standards that they should no longer be a priest, is so extreme that we can't, that's not tenable. So deposition, being deposed from holy orders, is going to be a penalty which is applied clearly more frequently than it has been in the past. Now, someone's just asked, what is a PTO? It's a permission to officiate. So clergy who are, if you like, fully functioning without any restriction is on a license. Licensed lay ministers are in a similar situation. Currently, a priest who has a permission to officiate can be given permission by the local vicar or the local archdeacon to take services on a regular basis. That can include taking services in rest homes, which is a category of vulnerable people. And so if you're taking services regularly, once a month, then you need to be fully subject to the standards, the ministry standards of the church, and subject to police checking and all of those provisions. So look, I suspect that's more than enough from me, and there may be some questions, but a little bit of a brief overrun of the Royal Commission and its work and some of the implications that are already emerging. So Stephen, I think you're going to facilitate any questions if we've still got time for those.
Thank you, Bishop. Indeed, we do have a little bit of time, and so there is absolutely space for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat box, and we'll do our best to cover off whatever you have in mind. Bishop, there's a question from Peter Theron. Can you see that one?
Yep, I can indeed. So, Peter, nice to hear from you. I hope you're well in Taranaki. So a Section 20 notice is Section 20 of the Royal Commissions Act, which establishes Royal Commissions as the ability of the Royal Commission to effectively require the release of information, to specify what that information is, and to enforce compliance. So we've received about 6 Section 20 notices since the work of the Commission began.
Thank you, Bishop. We also have a question. Please repeat the conditions for service leadership. Interpreting that as the expectations that you have of anyone in that role with respect to training.
I hope I'm understanding the question. I suspect it was when I was talking about how someone who has a full PTO and not what we're going to create, the PTO emeritus, someone who has a permission to officiate, they can be rostered in a parish or in a rest home to regularly take a service. So if that's once a month, that's regular. If you're taking regular services of worship, or if you're regularly in a pastoral situation, then the PTO allows you to do that. You will, however, very shortly have to, with holding a PTO, you will have to fully comply with supervision and spiritual direction, neither of which are required of someone holding a permission to officiate at the moment. You will be required to have regular police checking. And thirdly, you will be required to undertake these boundaries courses within a 3-year period. So it's really saying that a PTO, while it moves to a kind of lower level of expectation than a licensed priest, nonetheless, you're still in regular ministry, you're still ministering potentially to vulnerable people. The church is fully responsible and liable for your behaviour and your actions. Gray and St Paul's Patararu, potential financial implications. Now, that's the point of the redress hearing, Gray. The redress hearing is about working with the Commission as they formulate the recommendations that they make to the government. There's a wide recognition of the limits on the capacity of the church and other organisations to financially provide significant levels of financial redress. Nonetheless, it's clear that there is going to be clear bandings established and recommended to the government, and those bandings will relate to the level of abuse that's received. And the church will have to address that. We're beginning to figure out how we can fund that. What we're also, however, saying to the Commission, and others are making these points as well, is that redress is not simply about financial reparation. That redress can also mean support for the individual through things like counselling. Can also mean, as we saw vividly in a number of the bodies of evidence given at the Royal Commission, this abuse had often happened 50 years ago, and the intergenerational impact of the abuse on a child, on their children and on their grandchildren, was demonstrable. And so how do we respond through that generational impact is something that is critical. Malcolm, you asked the question around participation in all diocesan training. No, we're talking about training. You'll be required, if you hold a permission to officiate, to undergo boundaries training. That will be training which relates to your professional standards and safety of practice. There's a question from Michael Stevens about a layperson licensed to take services have to undertake the same requirements as a PTO. If a layperson is regularly visiting a rest home, then they need to undertake the same level of professional standards training as we would expect of a clergy person. If someone is working regularly in an unsupervised way with children, if someone is working regularly in an unsupervised way with young people, then a layperson, then the expectations of professional standards training will be exactly the same. And we're having to rethink and rework our professional standards training in order to take that into account. Expectation, Malcolm, that parishes pay for supervision and spiritual direction. The short answer is yes, and so we're going to have to think really carefully about both the benefit, the enormous benefit that we receive from those with permission to officiate licenses or permissions to officiate, provide to their parishes, and the requirement and the obligation we have to ensure safe practice. So bottom line, Malcolm, is yes, parishes will need to pay for those things which ensure professional standards and safe practice. Selwyn-centred volunteers. So one of the things we're going to have to look at is whether all volunteers, in a variety of circumstances, not just the Selwyn-centre volunteers, what level of professional standards compliance they will need. And one of the questions will be, are they under supervision? In other words, are they under constant visual supervision by someone who can be held accountable? And that's one of the issues for Sunday schools, for example, is that you might require full standards expectations of the supervisor, but if the excuse me, if the supervisor is in full sight contact with anyone who is providing teaching in a Sunday school or care of children, then it's the supervisor who will need to meet all the standards and not necessarily every participant. Same is also true of a situation where someone might be only occasionally supporting a ministry or a piece of work. The question always has to be, in the local context, how am I ensuring, as the vicar or whoever's in charge of the ministry unit, how am I ensuring best practice and safety for participants? Can I have confidence in it? What do we put in place? Most of it is common sense and applying common sense. Julie, you ask, who are we responsible for checking that PTO people are having spiritual direction and supervision? What evidence will they need to be given? We will have to, the bishops are talking about a standardised approach to this at the moment. We're working with the Ministry Standards Commission, which, remember, was only established today, to try and get some consistent guidelines across all of the Episcopal units. But the kind of thing that we're talking about is that a certificate will be required, like many other professional groups. I was providing professional supervision for someone who was a counsellor, a psychologist, over a number of years, and every year I had to sign a certificate to say that I was providing that professional supervision, what my qualifications to do that were, and how many times I had met with that psychologist in the given year. We're going to have to move to something like that. It'll be held in our database and it'll be regularly checked by a database that will throw out when we haven't been able to fill in the data that demonstrates compliance.
Thank you, Bishop. We may need to just pause the questions on the Royal Commission for a moment now, but we will have an opportunity towards the end of this evening, I hope, to go back to any questions if they're unanswered. And if that doesn't happen, please do send those questions in, and we'll ensure not only that they're answered, but they're shared in a good public place. No doubt, www.wtanglican.nz/boundaries-courses. That might be the last time you hear me say that web address.
Yeah, if I could just say, Stephen, that really please don't hesitate to ask the questions, because the questions help us to formulate our responses. We only see what we see, and we only are as good as the contribution that everyone can make. So, Steve.
Well, while the Bishop is heading down the corridor towards us, I'm going to take this opportunity on behalf of everyone to say how grateful we are to Bishop Philip, who has spent so much time dealing with such weighty challenges on behalf of so many. I don't think that we can overestimate how difficult that material was, and we are very grateful indeed for the sacrifices that Bishop Philip and the wider Anglican team have made in pursuit of some kind of justice. So please continue to keep all those involved in the Royal Commission in your thoughts and prayers. It's by no means over. The other thing I want to do right now is acknowledge all of those communities out there who have gathered together this evening. I think that's a really terrific part of what this online training creates, and I know a number of you have shared a meal as well. So may that hospitality and the manaakitanga and the community that you're building help to grow you as a faith community and grow God's kingdom as well. Keep doing what you're doing. I'm going to go back and share my screen again so that we get into the presentation. And we're at the point now, hopefully you can see new Title D legislation to cover off a few things before we look in more detail at the different canons. The first thing you need to know is simply where to find this stuff. And it's on the provincial website, and the link is right there. And my word, that would be a great simple question to put in a quiz, wouldn't it? That is a quiz I'll talk about in more detail. I just want to keep it on your radar so that you don't forget. It is SurveyMonkey. So if you're fit to move a mouse and a browser, then you're fit to knock off a multi-choice quiz. So I urge you to do that, although hard copies will be available. You've heard from the Bishop already a little bit about who this legislation applies to. So no surprises in the first bullet point. Everyone who has a license to a bishop, lay or ordained, this is for you. Canon 4 adds that all trustees of the church are also subject to these canons, and anyone, in fact, who has signed the Declaration of Assent to the Constitution, to POHE. So that means all vestry members, PTOs we've talked about in some detail, and assorted lay workers. So this has really broadened the scope, and it's important that one of the messages you take away to your community is the fact that we all have a responsibility to be aware of the code of conduct, the behaviour expected of us, and potential consequences. Again, the Bishop has touched a little bit on this next topic. Why would we change? Well, there has, as he said, been no comprehensive review for 10 years, and that's meant that we've had lots of little amendments made over quite a long period of time. And this rewrite has enabled all of those little bits and pieces to be regathered and reordered for consistency. It's a sad reality that in the church we faced a rising number of complaints, which have created an extraordinary amount of work, with sometimes fewer people available to support the processes. There is a really strong and universal desire for consistency and determinations across the whole province, and an acknowledgement that's made throughout the canons that bishops have pastoral and disciplinary responsibility. And although that will never change, the way that it manifests in the new process is slightly different. And it's the centralisation of the process which is utterly critical. I'm going to talk about that in some detail. And of course, you know that this is in part a response to the Royal Commission and the need to demonstrate that our standards are fit for purpose. And that reality is in fact enshrined in the canons as well. The new Ministry Standards Commission is canonically obliged to monitor the way that we audit this stuff. And so that's why we'll keep saying these are the expectations. This is not about some peculiar desire that we have, but this is above and beyond, and it's universal. So, how did this happen? Well, you may be surprised to learn that this is not spontaneous change in the Anglican Church. There have been several years of small group meetings with General Secretary, bishops, and key legal advisors, along a period of consultation right across the church seeking feedback. That feedback has really fundamentally changed parts of this legislation and proved how good the process has been. And it was, went through our own synod, as you know, and that helped to develop the working document, which was finally submitted to General Synod Te Hino Te Whānui last year and approved, passed in full. Since then, there's been another significant wave of feedback, which is going to mean a whole lot more review. There are some 50 or 60 minor amendments that just help to bring clarity to the legislation, and that will be further informed by any regulations that might come out of this as well. All of that will be reviewed over the next couple of years and be given real focus at General Synod in 2022. And the reason that we're doing this now, and the reason I'm so grateful that you've come back at the start of this new year and discovered training immediately, is in fact it came into force last week. So this is our new and current reality. Welcome to the New World Order. Here are some of the critical changes. You've heard one, that's our expectations of you, the expectations that come from outside of our own episcopal unit. But the other big change is around the Ministry Standards Commission, which is going to be set up. What will happen is that all complaints will go to the Registrar of the Ministry Standards Commission for an initial assessment. That assessment will result in one of three, not determinations, but decisions, if you like. It may be that the registrar reads the complaint and simply says, for one of a number of reasons, there's really nothing to pursue here, so it's dismissed. Or that registrar might decide that it is unsatisfactory conduct and refer it back to the diocesan bishop or the licensing bishop. Or it may be that it's deemed a case for misconduct needs to be heard, and then it's referred to a tribunal. We're going to go back over this in some detail, so just hold the broad brush in your mind at present. One of the effects of these changes is that the current discretion available to bishops will be limited. And that's freeing for them and freeing for complainants and respondents alike. That's not to disempower bishops specifically, but it's to ensure the kind of transparency, neutrality, and objectivity that's really important for us as an institution and for people looking into the way that we behave. It also offers significantly more protection to the complainant and the bishop. There's a brilliant half-hour presentation that's been put together by Bishop Philip, Jeremy Johnson, and Bruce Gray, and that's available on that increasingly familiar Boundaries Courses link. So if you want to know more about the nitty-gritty detail, that is the place to go. I see there is a question up about the quiz, so I'm going to pause and take a breath and respond to Andrew McKean. Is it one quiz per session? Yes, it is. When do we have to have it completed? Ideally within 3 weeks of seeing the video. Ultimately, you won't get your certificate and your approval until you've completed the quiz. Having the certificate is an expectation of your license. So I suspect that will strongly motivate you to answer the quiz sooner rather than later. The quiz, there are 3 separate quizzes for the first 3 sessions. Each is likely to be about 25 to 30 questions long, and they are multi-choice. There is not one quiz to rule them all, Andrew, sadly. We will be breaking it down. And yes, it will be clear who has to complete the quiz. All of that information will be on the website, so no one will be confused, I am confident. Andrew, if that hasn't answered your question satisfactorily, do flip me something in the chat box. Right. At about 8 o'clock, we'll pause for a breath, but if you can bear with me for the next quarter of an hour, we're going to look broadly at all of Title D and the canons within it, and then I'll look at Canon 1 in slightly more detail. Now, some of you will be wondering why there is a ruler as the motif going across each of these screens. If you're any kind of lover of Greek, you'll know that canon is the Greek word for rule or benchmark, and this canon is the one against our behaviour is measured. So these are word of the day, I can't resist them. What's the difference between canons and statutes? Canons apply to the whole province. So all Tikanga Pākehā, all Tikanga Māori, all Tikanga Polynesia. Canons across the church. Our statutes and regulations are those that we manage and maintain within our own diocese. When you go online to our General Synod Office website to look at all of these wonderful canons, you'll see that they're broken up into titles. Online we have titles A through to G. Tonight we're looking at Title D, which is concerned with standards of behaviour, and within it there are these 6 magnificent canons, all in sequential and logical order, which is enormously helpful. So taken together, they're an aspirational code of conduct, a process for handling complaints, as well as potential penalties for different kinds of behaviour, the way that we record and the way that we report that internally and publicly. So it's a way of holding one another accountable and a way of demonstrating credibility and integrity inside and outside the church. So Canon 1, concerning standards of ministry for bishops, ministers and office bearers, outlines the behavioural expectations associated with ministry in this church. That's the code, and that's the one that we really encourage you to read. It's a beautiful piece of work which describes a beautiful life. So look at it to have aims and objectives, ways of keeping yourself and your community accountable for the kind of life that we commit to as followers of Jesus Christ and his way. The second canon focuses in on the new Ministry Standards Commission. This is the body that's been established by General Synod, Te Hino Te Whānui, to manage and monitor complaints across the church. It's also going to be overseen by the registrar that Bishop talked about earlier. That's retired Justice John Priestley, who was a High Court judge in Auckland for about 13 years. So you can be confident of his experience and wisdom. The third canon, maintenance of ministry standards, is the process by which complaints are received, assessed, determined, and made public. The last part of this evening's presentation will be really focused in on that, so that you can be more confident you understand what's happening. And that's not necessarily so much about yourself and what you might be subject to, but it's so that other people can learn from your wisdom and your awareness of what's going on, so that you can appreciate what situation your colleagues or members of your community might find themselves in as well. Don't let this stuff be a surprise to you, because when things go wrong, you know that people need a solid, confident pastoral response. And this training and your own reading is intended to be the foundation for that. Fourth canon is around trustees. So all trustees of the church are now subject to the code of behaviour as the rest of us are. Number 5 insists that every episcopal unit in the province has a chancellor and sets out the kind of requirements that a chancellor needs to meet to qualify. And the last one is the prescribed practice concerning the transfer of ministers. It's lay and ordained between hui amarangi or diocese. And it includes a template for the information that needs to be communicated and stored so that everyone is kept, safe. Now, to pause there for a moment in case anyone needs to ask a question. And I see there is one here. The question is, If you hold a license in one diocese and a PTO in another, is there a need to repeat it across those boundaries? That decision has not yet been made, but you can say, if you have a PTO and another license for good reason, that you've already had fantastic training, and that might be a benchmark for what happens next. Says the ministry educator with some degree of caution and optimism. Are there any other quick questions before we look at this, the first canon, Canon 1, concerning standards? Oh, yes, there is some chat. The question is one that I'm going to read out aloud so the bishop can bail me out. Does Canon 4 include parochial trustees?
I would believe so, because a parochial trustee is subject to the declaration of adherence.
Brilliant. So the answer, if you couldn't quite hear that off microphone, is yes. Anyone who signs a declaration of adherence is subject, and parochial trustees, in all likelihood, should be signing such a declaration. Excellent. Still on target. So, Title D Canon 1. That is the Code of Conduct. And that's the one that I'm encouraging you to read closely for your own personal benefit. Read and inwardly digest. Now, if you're familiar with the previous Title D of standards, Canon 1 is effectively Part A of that. So if you look at Canon 1 and you're wondering where Parts B through F have got to, they're the new Canons 2 through 6. And as I said earlier, there's not a huge amount that's changed in this. What's important is there are a series of new terms like church advocate, informant, misconduct, unsatisfactory conduct, which are the result of that Canon 3 and the handling of complaints. So it is important that you come to terms with those, and we will be looking at it. It has been reordered and regrouped into standards so that it just makes sense and runs a little more smoothly. And there have been some maybe slightly curious additions. Holiness has been refined to exclude immorality. Financial probity, that's integrity with money, is entirely new. And some of you will be disappointed to learn that where it did read from temperate, from you should be temperate, to you must be temperate, self-controlled in your behaviour, not harass others, and not be abusive towards others. Further, adultery is now inconsistent with chastity, and basically this, like me, may make you wonder what people tried to argue in the point up until now. All of this has been deliberately tidied up. It's really very clear and helpful. So do please read it and share it. That brings us to the end of the second part, talking about an overview of those canons, how they relate to one another, and why you should read the first of them. So if you've got any questions in that space, please do raise a hand, type in a question, or hit the chat. Thank you, Charmaine Sarton. What is an informant? I should be pleased to read it to you. What it means is that under the new legislation, the church will be the party who brings any proceedings under Title D. So rather than the complainant having to advocate for herself or himself, it will fall to the church as the informant to bring that party, and to be the party who brings the proceedings. Are there any other questions at this stage? Or any clarity required for that last answer? That'll make a bit more sense when I talk about the wider process and how the different parts fall into it. one of the last slides we'll look at is a very simple, say that advisedly, a simplified version of the process across the possible decisions. And we'll try to feed some simple examples in there to talk about who will take responsibility at different times. And that was that opportunity to pause and ask questions. I'm going to invite you to take a break in your local groups or on your hand immediately after I respond to Jekili, who I think is going to ask a question, and Ian's concern with criminal behaviour. The criminal behaviour question, I don't see where criminal behaviour is discerned. The matter may be directly referred to the police. Yes, Ian, that comes out of the third canon really clearly. This is by no means a substitute for criminal proceedings. As soon as someone identifies criminal behaviour, they must refer it to the appropriate authority for action. And that doesn't prevent the church from pursuing any other disciplinary processes that it might need to undertake for its own integrity and pursuit of natural justice, but it may mean that the two run in parallel. But certainly we're not a substitute for such matters. Great question, thank you. All right, let's pause for 5 minutes and come back at 8 o'clock. An opportunity to grab a drink or have a wander. Thank you for your attention so far. Welcome back, everyone. We've had a couple of questions during the break, which the Bishop will address now. One is concerning the process and how the case is prosecuted and who stands for whom.
Thank you. So this is another sort of go at Charmaine's question, which is a really important question. So up until now, one of the great deficiency of our legislation has been that effectively, if you're the complainant, you have to prosecute your own case, and you had to often employ a lawyer. Cost was yours. It was quite wrong. If you think about criminal proceedings or even civil proceedings, like criminal proceedings, what happens is that if the Crown believes that there is a case, it's not the survivor of the crime who has to prosecute that case, it's the Crown prosecutor. And the police will often be in the role of informant, so providing the evidence. So that's the kind of parallel. The church advocate will advocate the case, will prosecute the case, and the informant will present the evidence. So a complainant may be a witness, but is called on behalf of the church versus Philip Richardson in the case. I hope that makes sense. Now, the other question is...
There's a question concerning the requirements for a layperson in a cooperating parish. It's a good question. That will depend upon the kind of ministry being extended. Anyone who extends ministry on behalf of the bishop and who has signed a declaration of adherence to Te Pauhere Constitution will need to complete the boundaries training. If they are not a member of if they've not signed that declaration and they're not acting on behalf of the Anglican Church, then the answer may be different, but I would like to think that we would encourage all our members to do the boundaries training so we've got consistency and confidence across the board.
Joyce Marcon, actually from Joyce, you've asked a question, and I simply can't answer it, but the question's a really important one. So what are the responsibilities on clergy who are in charge of a parish or ministry units to require the same standards of other church community users of parish facilities? Now, we had a kind of parallel situation during the moving through the levels of COVID response, where we had to figure out what was the liability or the responsibilities of the owner of the property, and therefore parish vestry or priest in charge of a parish acting on behalf of the owner of the trust board in relation to the standards of hygiene and use of the facility. It's a very similar question. There was a clear health and safety liability there that was identified. I assume that that would be similar, that we would have to make sure that if a scout group Girls Brigade group or some other group that was using, that they had in place requirements for safe and best practice. But I will check that, because it's a great question. I don't know the answer. I'm surmising.
We have another question here concerning the consequences for those who can be proved to have brought vexatious complaints. I haven't read anything in these new canons that deal directly with vexatious complaints, but I can say that most complaints, we'll talk about this, will go through the licensing bishop, and that licensing bishop does have the discretion to exclude some complaints under some circumstances. So the trivial or the vexatious, if it can be demonstrated to be either, they may be excluded, but certainly there's no discussion of penalty for anyone who might bring a vexatious complaint.
Yep. Paul, if you do take an example of, say, something that is accepted by the registrar as being a complaint that is requires investigation and to go to a tribunal, and it's proved in the course of that process to be vexatious, then there are two possible responses. Costs can be awarded, and there is a requirement that the result is published, which means that the person who has brought the vexatious complaint is named, and it becomes publicly available. Now that kind of restriction on bad behaviour is frankly not available at the moment, and I receive a number of vexatious complaints on a monthly basis. Currently, I'm not required to publish the name of someone who sends a vexatious complaint, but following this process, publication is required.
And a question concerning whether or not supervision and spiritual direction can be done in groups, or does it need to be one-to-one?
That's another great question. My view is that there are very sound peer supervision models in place. It's not about a group of colleagues simply getting together and say we're going to supervise each other. They are models with professional standing, but allows for groups to be supervised collectively, and of course that impacts on cost and all of those sorts of things, so I get that. The only caveat that I would put to that is that we are really trying to get consistency across all the dioceses in Amarangi, so those kinds of guidelines are going to have to be agreed to across the bishops, but I've given you my personal view.
Thank you, Bishop, and thank you all for an excellent set of questions which are proving to add real value to this. There is another that's come through in the chat. Do we expect a reduction in people seeking a licence or resignations of current licence holders as a result of the new procedures?
Well, I think one answer to that is that if greater clarity of standards and greater level of accountability leads some to feel that they don't feel able to meet those expectations or to respond to that level of accountability, then it would be sensible for them to resign the licence. Certainly, I anticipate that we will have to be more rigorous around recognising where people haven't fulfilled the requirements of licence. If they haven't fulfilled those requirements, then I will be withdrawing licences probably more frequently than has been my practice.
Thank you. We're going to get back to the slides and presentation now so that we can dig into Canon 3, which concerns the maintenance of ministry standards. So this is the effective equivalent of parts B through E of Canon 1. Does establish that Ministry Standards Commission we talked about and the Registrar, Justice John Priestley, alongside a pool of tribunal members. So that Ministry Standards Commission will find a list of people who are appropriate to act on a panel that assesses a misconduct hearing. And we'll talk about how they get appointed in a moment. All complaints will be processed by this office, and a desire to establish greater consistency, experience and appropriate expertise in this space. I'm going to touch on the different parts, and then we'll have an overview of what a complaints process might look like. First part, in principle, anyone may make a written complaint, even if they are not the subject. The respondent, that is the person about whom the complaint is made, receives details of the allegations, the complainant, and is offered access to legal advice. As Bishop discussed earlier, the church then becomes the informant and prosecutes the complaint rather than the subject or complainant. The registrar makes the initial review and recommendation. This canon has been designed to flex with the nuances of different tikanga, and as we made the point earlier, it's no substitute for criminal proceedings. Part B reminds us that complaints must be written, and there will be some guidance and regulations forthcoming that describe the shape of those complaints. It doesn't mean that you can't hear a complaint orally, but it will need to be committed to paper at some point. Also describes some of the time limits for complaints, which is normally 3 years and up to 6 years, unless those complaints are of a sexual nature, in which case there are no restrictions on time. You may only bring the same complaint once. If there is new information that is considered to be significant, that may adjust that, but generally speaking, one shot per complaint. Part C outlines the registrar's power to make initial assessments, which are broadly one of three: to dismiss the complaint, to assess it as unsatisfactory conduct, or to assess it as misconduct. Irrespective of what that initial assessment is, the respondent has a right to appeal it, and there's a guarantee that there's access to pastoral support for all parties. The two new terms that we need to grasp are unsatisfactory conduct and misconduct. So if you think in terms of Canon 1 describing the exemplary conduct, the conduct to which we all aspire, unsatisfactory conduct is below that, misconduct is significantly below that. So we're going in order of seriousness of poor conduct. First, unsatisfactory, a failure to observe standards required of ministers, which does not amount to misconduct. If that's the assessment that the registrar makes on receiving that written complaint, then she or he can refer it directly back to the licensing bishop or archbishop. In that case, the emphasis of the whole process is around reconciliation and forgiveness. With some investigation, it may be demonstrated that admonishment is required, and such admonishment will be kept on file. And there may also be recommendations to undertake further training or counselling. So that's handled by the bishop. Part E concerns misconduct. That's intentional, significant, or continuing departure from the standards of ministry set out in Canon 1. Now we're looking at the handling of complaints that have met that threshold for misconduct. In it, you'll see the appointment of a church advocate. That's a lawyer that is a barrister or solicitor of New Zealand with at least 7 years experience. That lawyer will conduct the proceedings. And then the licensing bishop will appoint 3 tribunal members, but it's not quite that simple, because it's the registrar who recommends the 3 tribunal members for appointment from the list maintained at the Ministry Standards Commission for the bishop to approve. So here that's distinction. While the bishop appoints, those appointments are on the advice of the registrar from a specific list, and how that the representation will come to in a moment. If the registrar reads a complaint and is convinced that a threshold for risk has been met, there is an opportunity to have a suspension. There's a 24-hour window, and the respondent has a right to appeal that, but if that appeal fails, then the suspension will take place. Whatever happens, an investigation follows, and then there are a series of determinations available. So it may be, again, dismissal, no case to be heard, or no clear evidence of misconduct. But if there is misconduct, there'll be one of 4 recommendations made. An order of seriousness, from admonition to suspension, deprivation of office, and ultimately deposition. All of those are defined in the canon for you. Also, at the end, it describes the reporting obligations placed upon the Ministry Standards Commission and what will be reported in a public register. That is an online database that records misconduct of anyone who has had a determination under Part E. So, in the hopes that I can anticipate some questions, here is my attempt to try and capture the process. If you look in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see, or should see, subject and complainant. That's because the two may not necessarily be the same person. The subject of the person who alleges that something has happened to them may submit a written complaint, or someone else may do so on their behalf. Whoever it is becomes the complainant. That written complaint, or potentially oral, goes through a bishop, minister, or office bearer. That's what the canon says at present. So, if you're one of those 3 things, you could well receive a written complaint. Wisdom of a purple kind suggests strongly that you would want to refer that immediately to the bishop for the bishop's consideration and discernment. Unless, of course, it's a complaint about the bishop, in which case you'd be completely within your right to go directly to the registrar. You're still completely within your right to go directly to the registrar, but again, wisdom does strongly advise you to go to the bishop first. Either way, the written complaint will go on to the registrar, who will receive it and make that initial assessment that I talked about, which may be one of 3 broad categories. If you like, the green light will be that the complaint is dismissed. The registrar decides that there's simply not enough in there to warrant further investigation under this canon. Or the registrar may decide that it looks like unsatisfactory conduct, and then it's immediately referred back to the licensing bishop. The bishop then considers what has happened, and with the principles of forgiveness and reconciliation, we'll look at an investigation which may result in admonishment and may well result in a referral to additional counselling or training. So that's complaints that are dismissed or unsatisfactory conduct, where unsatisfactory conduct is referred back to your licensing bishop. Misconduct is the most serious of the 3 possibilities. If the registrar assesses that that's what needs to be investigated, then immediately the church advocate will be appointed. That's the barrister or solicitor who will investigate and prosecute on behalf of the complainant. That church advocate will pull together a formal document with all the required detail, as well as the respondent's response to the allegations that have been made. That will feed into the hearing process, which is conducted with the tribunal. Now, as I mentioned before, the tribunal is appointed by the licensing bishop, but it is the result of 3 names prepared and presented by the registrar with reference to 4 things. One of the 3 people must be ordained, one of the 3 must be a layperson, and the 3rd must be a barrister or solicitor of at least 7 years experience or equivalent. The 4th criterion concerns one of them, any of the 3, being a member of the episcopal unit in question. And that appointment is, all the appointments are made to ensure that there's no sense of bias, but there is a sense of local knowledge as well. Then there is the hearing, and the hearing will lead to a determination and a recommendation. So, a determination may simply be that there was no misconduct. Ultimately, there was nothing to be heard, and the allegations, for one reason or another, have been rejected. If the recommendation is that misconduct has been found, then that purple line you can see is a kind of a filter before admonition, suspension, deprivation of office, or deposition. That means that there is a window of opportunity where submissions must be sought from the licensing bishop and from the respondent. Once those have been sought and potentially supplied, then a final recommendation is made, which the bishop is obliged to follow. So it could be admonition, suspension, temporary thing, deprivation of office, or deposition. Now, if you don't know the details of those, you can read about them, but know that it becomes increasingly serious as you go from top to bottom. Now, we are coming up to almost 8:25, and we have covered off the key parts of the process. What remains from here is a discussion about appeals, publication of the details, and safe to receive testimonials. So I would like to attend to those before we finish this evening, and we'll take as many questions as we can up until about 8:30, maybe a few minutes over, and the rest of those questions we'll publish with answers online in the next couple of days. I'll just have a quick look to see if there is a process question that needs to be dealt with. Yes, the statement is, so the church advocate is analogous to the prosecutor and the tribunal to the court, and the respondent has the right to representation. We're all happy with that. Thank you for that point of clarity. So appeals can, of course, be made. I talked about the initial appeal if the question of suspension has been raised within the first 24 hours. More broadly, once a recommendation has been made, that's the formal recommendation, you have 20 days to make an appeal. And that will require most likely some kind of new evidence. Remember that that appeal may come from either party, from the respondent or the church advocate. If such appeal is entertained, then it will go to the appeal tribunal, which is the layer above what was used in the preceding misconduct hearing. And that will include the provincial chancellor, relevant primates, and a member of the judicial committee. Now, the judicial committee is a body of legal experts that's appointed by Te Hinota Whanui. So that's an existing body that they would appeal to. And it will be the same process that you've heard, but at a layer above. So the last slide, which is in fact questions, let me pause on that because I will talk about the very last canon for a moment. That's Canon 6, which is just 2 sides of an A4, and it describes the transfer of information between dioceses or hui amarangi or even provinces potentially when a bishop asks for a safe to receive. That's a record of what kind of conduct the bishop has experienced of the person. So all of the reporting obligations which capture unsatisfactory conduct and misconduct go into a template and are communicated, and it's irrespective of whether you're a clergy person or a lay person or any kind of office bearer within the church. It will apply to all of those people. So that's the end of the formal presentation, an overview of the Title D and its 6 canons, those ones nested inside it. There is a bit of time now to answer some questions, which I'll share with Bishop Philip. They'll come on screen in a moment, so do start feeding them through. So the first one that I have here: should an allegation of misconduct in a ministry role in another organisation, for example, the Order of St John Chaplaincy, be received, whose process deals with that complaint?
Well, the answer to that is that potentially both. And that I spoke earlier about the issue of vicarious liability. So if a priest is a priest is a priest, then the priest might have an allegation of professional misconduct as a teacher, for example, in their teaching role, and go through the teacher's registration process for a complaint. But that may also, in the church's consideration, impact on their suitability, depending on the offence, to exercise ordained ministry. And the church reserves its right to be able to to follow due process in relation to that. I think that makes, I hope that's clear. You can imagine a situation, for example, where a teacher is involved in an inappropriate relationship with a minor. The teacher would be held accountable for that. The church would also view that as having an impact on the suitability of someone to hold a bishop's licence, and maybe indeed their suitability to be in holy orders.
I've got a question, Joyce, that's come through from you. Would you be able to provide us with a little bit more clarity, please, Bishop, as you've unpacked that?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't.
Okay, so again from Peter, thank you. What is the practicing status of the respondent while the process is in progress? In part, that depends on how the complaint has been received and assessed by the registrar. So if it's unsatisfactory conduct, then it's referred to the bishop, and the bishop determines what the status of the respondent is. If it's misconduct, then either there's that initial period of time where the registrar may invoke immediate suspension, or at the end of the recommendation process, it may be that the respondent finds him or herself suspended.
I think the expectation, Peter, would be that if something is evaluated by the registrar, assessed by the registrar to be misconduct, then it's in everyone's interest that the respondent is suspended. And I mean, if I was a respondent in that situation, I would step down. I think there's an obligation on us to recognise that due process needs to happen, and that we are better to step aside from the ministry to allow that process to happen, and for there to be a transparency about that.
Another great question, this time from Kath. How much of this information needs to be conveyed to our teams who volunteer in our ministry, and how will this be done? Well, you've got a sense now, I hope, of how widespread the obligations are under this new canon, these new canons rather, and who it affects. As our leaders in the different ministry units, it'd be great if you took that responsibility of communicating those expectations on. You know now that there will be a video available, and this PowerPoint that you've seen, and a few other notes to help people understand what those obligations are. So do encourage them to keep up to date. They'll be recognised, if they want to do the quiz, they'll be recognised and certified appropriately as well. And look, in an ideal world, we would love for all our volunteers to engage with this and the next boundaries really thoroughly.
If I could just add, I think the positive way of approaching this with teams of volunteers is actually to use the ministry standards section of Title D, because it's actually, Stephen called it a beautiful thing, and it actually is. It's very aspirational and it's deeply rooted in Scripture and in our aspirations as Christians to live out the gospel as followers of Jesus. And framed like that, the language is careful, it's positive, it's aspirational, as I say. It's what we all seek to live by, and one level, none of us will ever fully attain it. But I think when people understand that all of this is in the context of that gospel expectation on the way we live our lives in relation to each other, then the processes that test serious failure, serious misconduct, are well understood. All of us want for our church to be held accountable individually and collectively for breaches of these kinds of standards. So I would say grab the positive, deal with that.
I think I've got clarity on the question that was to be asked earlier. What happens if a complainant lays a complaint, but the subject denies anything happened?
Sorry, ask me the question again.
So you have the subject, the putative victim, shall we say, and
putative.
Yeah, that's another word for the day. Force. Yeah, you get two for tonight, everyone. And the complainant is aware that something's happened and decides to make a written complaint to the registrar. And when the registrar goes to assess that complaint, the person alleged to have had the negative behaviour says, "Don't know what you're talking about."
Mm-hmm.
What happens now?
Unless there's substantiating evidence, it would be dismissed.
There's your answer. Another question here regarding permission to officiate. And what happens if you are an occasional service taker or have to fill in for a vicar at short notice? Can you get short-term approval as required?
I mean, this is talking about a kind of specific case, and I mean, the question goes on to say, what if the archdeacon can't be contacted at short notice? You know, try and get hold of me would be the answer to that. Try and get hold of another archdeacon. You're imagining a permission to officiate with a permission to officiate emeritus. Someone with a permission to officiate licence under the new regime that I've described would be able to be invited at short notice to take a service because they're fulfilling all the requirements of professional standards. So I'm assuming you're talking about someone with under the new regime, permission to officiate emeritus. I would want to talk that through with the bishop's staff team, but I would expect the conclusion we'll come to is that an archdeacon should be able to give approval for an immediate response to that sort of need, and it's in a kind of one-off situation. And if an archdeacon can't be contacted, my cell phone is published, and believe you me, it's amazing who rings me, so why not?
This may be our last question for the evening before we pray and bless you good night, and that's come from Jekili. Who is the registrar accountable to? Would he or she act alone in the initial process of receiving the complaints?
So the Ministry Standards Commission appoints the registrar, and the registrar is accountable to that Ministry Standards Commission. That commission is made up of 3 members of the legal profession who have been a solicitor and barrister at bar for a minimum of 7 years, 1 from each tikana. And currently, we've just appointed 2 out of the remaining 3. One of them actually is from this diocese, Diane Cameron, clinical psychologist, who's on the psychologists board of review and has acted for abuse victims as a friend of court, and has been part of the assessment process and discernment for ordination in this diocese for the best part of 20 years. The other person is another clinical psychologist, Tikana Māori, highly experienced, worked extensively with those convicted of child sexual offences, and the final position on that Ministry Standards Commission is open to appointment, because we're allowing the Commission to establish themselves and their work and to identify where they think there may be some gaps. So the registrar is accountable to that professional body, and any decision of the registrar, as you saw from the process, is subject to appeal.
Thank you, Bishop. I'm going to call that the last answer to the last question in the interests of getting you all home close to a reasonable hour. And I want to thank you all. That was a huge amount of content that we covered this evening, so we appreciate your focus and your concentration and commitment. Do remember that if you go online, all of the expectations and the next steps will be laid out very simply on the Boundaries Courses page, which is very easy to find. If you have additional questions that you want to submit, please just send them through to me, stephen@wtanglican.nz, or there's a submit questions on the website at the very bottom of the page as well. One way or another, it will come to me and be answered. Spread the word. This is a really critical piece of work that we're undertaking now, and be confident that we are undertaking it nice and early so you are onto it, because it's about protecting you and those that we work with. I would like us again to pause and close in prayer, but I'd like to check in with the Bishop in case there are any final comments that you'd like to make.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone, and thank you, Stephen, for the hard preparation that you've put into this. I know that this is going to be spread out amongst the bishops tomorrow morning, this presentation, and will I'm sure be really helpful, given, as I said, the Commission was established at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and the registrar was appointed at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Stephen's kind of stolen the run on everyone, so thank you for that.
Thank you, Bishop, and let's give thanks to God. Loving God, you cross boundaries of life and death. You orient us to your ways if only we are willing to listen. So guide us at all times to follow your example, to serve faithfully, to be safe, and to keep the safety of others. This we pray in the name of the one who loves and forgives, Jesus Christ, our Saviour. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all, bless you and good night, and look forward to seeing you in 1 month's time to talk about boundaries and power, and then beyond that to the internet and social media. Until then, ka kite anō.